Boy, from raids on Indiana's largest voter registration group, police raids, taking this personal cell phones of the employees, from that to this piece. This is over at talkingpointsmemo.com. The headline says it all. States keep weaseling around court orders blocking GOP voting restrictions. The Republicans are doing everything they possibly can. The Supreme Court's at stake. Right? This isn't just Republican perfidy. The Supreme Court is at stake, and then you've got, the Koch brothers and their network spending hundreds of millions of dollars to make sure that Republican senators get reelected so that the Senate can still stay in Republican hands so that they can prevent Hillary Clinton from appointing any kind of true liberal to the court. This is absolutely strategic, in my humble opinion. The article over at TPM by Tierney Sneed talks about how, there have been all these favorable court decisions, right, where various federal courts, and in some cases state courts, have knocked down Republican voting restrictions, saying, well, as in the case of North Carolina, they said that the ones that Pat McCrory and his Republican buddies in the North Carolina House and Senate, they control all three branches of the North Carolina government, that they basically inquired, how do voting patterns of black people differ from the voting patterns of white people? And they found that black people tend more often to vote on Sunday or on weekends. The whole souls to the polls thing, take people from churches right to the polling places. African Americans are more likely to be working during the weekdays on jobs where they don't have paid time off. One of the legacies of slavery, Jim Crow, and the ongoing systemic, people call it systemic bias. I think that's a nice little euphemism. I call it white privilege, racism. Republicans do not want black people to vote. They don't want young people to vote. They don't want old people to vote. These are all voting groups that tend to vote heavily Democratic. They only want middle-aged white men to vote, because they can crank them up with all their testosterone and all their anger and, oh, we're going to be tough, we're going to be strong, yeah, don't worry. So what they're doing, this is the ACLU's Voting Right Project. Dale Ho is the director of that. And he's talking about how even though in state after state, the right to vote, for all people to vote, has been won in court, the states are refusing to implement these court-ordered changes, rolling back the restrictions. He says if you step back, you take a step back, and it's really appalling. I mean, the Department of Justice and other groups, we have all won the cases. You would have thought we would have been finished with this whole thing when up until Election Day, we have to stay on these people. He says there's two things going on. One is we have seen court-ordered softening of voter ID laws in places like Wisconsin and Texas, and then either foot-dragging or incompetence in carrying it out, which has led to follow-up lawsuits or threats of lawsuits. This was Richard Hansen, a professor at the UC Irvine School of Law, who also runs the election law blog. He says the other thing that's going on is new shenanigans in response to court rulings, and that's North Carolina. The author notes, in North Carolina, the partisan-motivated chicanery is perhaps most glaring after an appeals court restored a week of early voting in a monumental decision that said provisions of a 2013 North Carolina election law were passed with discriminatory intent. That's the one I was just telling you about. A handful of Republican-led county election boards sought to limit voting hours in the extra week to a bare minimum, apparently at the behest of a leaked memo sent by a state Republican Party official. Early voting is disproportionately popular among Democratic-leaning minorities. It's just Just incredible. Outside of North Carolina, they write, in other states where voting rights advocates have won court victories, concern has been raised whether voters are being properly educated about rights guaranteed to them by recent rulings. Jennifer Clark, counsel for the Brennan Center's Democracy Program, said the trend that you're definitely seeing is that although you may win in court, so much of what actually matters to voters depends on implementation of that court victory. So getting a ruling that blocks or softens a restrictive voting law is really only the first step to making sure that people have the right to vote. This is just like in the 1870s when the southern states, were told by the federal government, you must let African Americans vote. And for a very short time there, in the late 1860s and early 1870s, African Americans actually, they took over North Carolina, if my recollection is correct. Maybe it was South Carolina, but they actually had a majority in the legislature. African Americans became a political force in the South for about a decade. And then the white Southerners figured out how to push back. Oh, well, you want to vote? Oh, that's fine. No problem. You can vote. We'll comply with the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendments. I guess this would be the 15th Amendment. We'll go along with that. You just have to recite the Constitution without making a single mistake before you can vote. Oh, and there's a poll tax also. You've got to pay $50. Oh, and you've got to fill out this form that, it's just throwing things at people, right? This literacy test. You have to be able to recite Shakespeare's 22nd sonnet. You know that, right? And they're doing the exact same thing. It's not literally the exact same thing, but it's functionally the exact same thing. They're saying, oh, yeah, sure, we'll let black people vote. Will you millennials vote? No problem. Except that they've got to have a kind of ID that a student at a college who doesn't own a car typically doesn't have. And we're going to cut out the weekend voting, and we're going to move the vote. We're going to shut down some of the voting locations, especially those near colleges. And we're going to reduce the number of voting machines or voting, polling places so that the lines will be 3, 4, 5, 6 hours long. So if you want to vote, forget about taking an hour off work. You're going to have to take the whole day off work. This is, it is criminal, actually. They're violating court orders, but it's also morally criminal. This is just obscene. The Republicans think if they can suppress enough of the vote, they might be able to get Donald Trump into the White House and thus, as Donald Trump has suggested, get another Antonin Scalia back on the Supreme Court instead of Merrick Garland. And should Ruth Bader Ginsburg resign, or Anthony Kennedy, or Clarence Thomas, or pretty much anybody, or, God forbid, become infirm or die, then, they could have 2, 3, maybe even 4 seats on the Supreme Court by the end of the next 4 years. And they know, what that means. This is serious stuff. They know exactly what that means. It means that the Supreme Court will then go along with them in these voter restrictions. We'll have national Jim Crow laws. And the Supreme Court will continue to expand corporate power and the ability of very wealthy people to buy politicians. And the Supreme Court will continue down that Scalia road of turning America from a democratic republic into an autocratic oligarchy.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
And we're more than halfway there already. We cannot afford Republican control of the House, Senate, or White House. Get active.